Hello, welcome to Dialogue. I'm Pandong in Beijing. US President Barack Obama has published a piece in the Washington Post newspaper calling for support for the US-led Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. In it, he singles out China as a competitor which hopes to succeed at the expense of the United States and urges people to resist. But is TPP advantageous for both the Asia-Pacific and America? Is the American president the victim of a lingering Cold War mentality when it comes to international economics? And how could the world's two largest economies work together to benefit their own nations and others in the fastest growing region in the world? To discuss all these issues and more, I'm joined in the studio by Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics and Mr. Robert Kapp, Director of the Economist Corporate Network. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at this.
The Trans-Pacific Partnership, 12 countries in talks and an aggregate GDP accounting for a third of the world's total. If ratified, it would deliver significant economic benefits to the US and 11 partners, from a sweeping liberalization of barriers on trade and investment. US President Barack Obama published an article in the Washington Post recently calling for the urgent need to approve the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Pact, which could eliminate more than 18,000 taxes on US exports. He said that the TPP would let America, not China, lead the way on global trade. China's foreign ministry on Tuesday said global trade rules should be decided by all countries rather than just one.
We think global trade rules should be discussed by all countries, not just set by one. China has an open attitude towards the TPP, and we think the TPP should be promoted together along with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, to help achieve the common goal of a free trade zone in the Asia-Pacific.
To face the challenge of TPP, experts say China should accelerate strengthening its industrial international competitiveness.
China should continue to develop bilateral FTA talks with neighboring countries. China needs to adopt more proactive regional cooperative strategies.
The world's largest ever trade deal was officially signed in New Zealand earlier this year. The 12 member countries have 2 years to ratify the deal. But with US elections due later this year, the big question is whether a new president will get the congressional support needed to bring the deal into force.
So let's get the discussion started. Gentlemen, before we get into the wording of this blunt article, I'd like to talk about the timing first. Now, it's about 6 months into the US presidential elections. Do you think Barack Obama is speaking out his true thoughts, or this is just part of a political stunt? Professor?
Well, I would rather take it as a black humor because number one, China is now taking 13% of the whole world share, and nobody really can dwarf China's role in the global rulemaking process. And yes, this is really there to serve as a political rhetoric, to pacify some of the controversies that is still in the cooking within the bipartisan the mechanism. And third, I think is his ego. You know, honestly, I personally do not see his big achievement, but now this is really a milestone. This chapter in the White House to have the TPP really successfully passed. So therefore, there is a sense of eagerness and imperativeness within his own mind.
Well, Mr. Kapp, we know that the ratification, the possible ratification of the TPP in the US Congress is hotly debated, if not gloomy. Yeah. So do you think Barack Obama is trying his best in his last period in the White House, trying to leave a legacy that actually can be remembered?
Well, I think your comments on Congress are key here, and I think that's really the dynamic. And echoing some of Baocheng's sentiments, but going more at that dimension of American politics, not so much related to the presidential cycle. Yes, he's ending his term. Indeed, foreign policy hasn't been his strong suit, and I'm sure he would like to leave more of a lasting impression that he was effective in that. But I think his number one objective here is to convince Congress, which he has never had good relations with, to pass this thing, because ultimately it's up to them. And I think what he's wanting to do is set the stage for the presumptive next president, Hillary Clinton, to be able to go in and pass this.
So let's follow that thought and let's get into the wording of this article. He says either America can take the lead in the Asia-Pacific economy or sit on the sidelines and watch prosperity pass by. Sounds exactly like zero-sum game, doesn't it?
Well, I think on the positive side, he recognizes the importance of the Asian market. So he said that Asia is on the road to be the open and the lucrative market for the U.S. Business. And on the other hand, he is also very much alert and even resistant to the participation of the second nation in terms of size of the economy and the first nation in terms of the trade. So that shows that his lack of confidence actually in allowing or inviting the participation of China. And I think actually the neighbors and even the participant members in the TPP are well aware the importance and interdependence they are having with China in terms of trade and economic development. So, this really manifests the sense of superiority, but which is not really very much legitimized in today. Well, that's rather provocative to China, but I think the China's attitude is rather, acceptable. It is really, all the nations who are now getting interdependent, all the members who are there together to shift the role instead of one hegemonistic driver's seat taken by one big nation, however big you are today.
What's your take, Mr. Kemp?
Well, indeed. I mean, there are these overtones of hegemony and so forth, but it is interesting when you think about FTAs, free trade agreements. So whether you're talking about TPP, RCEP, there's a whole slew of alphabet soup. I mean, this goes back to, in my memories at least, in what was relevant to the United States, NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, which was a big issue in the 90s. And it's interesting because you're actually involving lots of partners. It's less an issue. I know it's framed that way in China a lot, this hegemony, and certainly President Obama's article invites that critique because he's talking about us versus China, granted. However, what it's really about are various interests, and the criticisms of these agreements is it's corporate interest versus common interests, such as the labor force or environmental protection and so forth. TPP is a bit different because it does try to elevate the bar. It requires more of worker rights, IPR and so forth. There are still criticisms, but I think it's less about nation versus nation than getting a group of nations behind a common sort of standards of trade.
But there's also a discourse in the United States goes like this. The TPP is actually the United States want to set up a whole new set of rules of game without China's participation. Do you think so?
Well, in addition to the exclusion of China, they also have a strong sense of superiority not only in the United States but in the TPP framework versus the RCEP that is China is pushing forward at in terms of the labor standard, environmental standard, the level of IP protection, and and also the dispute settlement mechanism. So they actually, China really take a broad-minded approach, and we do not identify the U.S. as a competitor, and we identify TPP and RCEP should move in parallel because they are working towards the same goal: further regional integration to push forward the a more liberalized free trade and facilitation of investment. So now that President Obama is really trying to identify a sort of enemy without in order to invite the preference of big businesses and also ignite the sense of nationalism in the United States during this political juncture.
Well, gentlemen, both mentioned this RCEP, that's Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and President Barack Obama claims that RCEP will allow unfair competition, will result in internet censorship, and will trample intellectual property rights, particularly those of American companies. Do you agree, Mr. Kemp?
Well, I think it's a legitimate point to raise regarding another set of trade rules where currently the U.S. and China do have legitimate disputes about internet freedom. And that is becoming more a commercial issue, not just as the original assumption was it's about human rights. You know, when our major companies like Google and Facebook can't get in here, that's a trade issue too. So I think the critique of RCEP that you're hearing from the United States is looking at that. Also with India in particular, we have a lot of issues with IPR and pharmaceuticals, intellectual property rights, not less with China. But I think that's part of it, because when you look at RCEP, it's China and India are the big economies there, and a lot of other Asian economies that the U.S. would like to engage with, such as New Zealand, which is part of TPP and so forth, and Australia as well. So it's like you have that sense of competition, but China is correct that you could have the two agreements side by side. It's not an either-or dilemma here.
So, gentlemen, do you think there is a fundamental difference in philosophy or in strategic thinking? Because if you take a look at China's very own initiatives, like the One Belt and Road Initiative, it's all about inclusiveness and harmony and common prosperity, but we rarely heard those terms in American proposals, Professor?
Well, one is in the line with the principle of dogmatism, and the other is going for pragmatism. So the RCEP is more pragmatically operated and with consideration and also respect of the cultural differences and also the differences in development level and also all those historical legacy. So let's go for early harvest. So step by step, we go for integration instead of doing it one blow. And also the respect into the sovereignty rights is something that is written in Chinese constitution, in Chinese diplomatic principle that we are really adhering into. So the U.S. type they are pursuing a sort of a universal value and are trying to really promote, if not impose, the sort of labor standard, environmental standard, etc., related with human rights. So that's something, there is a fundamental difference in the philosophy on both sides.
So some observers, Mr. Kapp, say that this article is a typical example of the Cold War mentality, if not the ancient and sometimes outdated Greek thinking of Thucydidean trap. Right. So help us understand the U.S. mentality here.
Well, what you referred to is something you really only hear in China. That doesn't mean it doesn't have legitimate points, but you don't hear that critique from other parts of Asia, say that this is Cold War. I mean, a lot of Asia also looks on China.
No, it's not Cold War. It's Cold War mentality. It's about clash of philosophies and ideologies even.
Fair enough, and there is some of that. And I think what Bao Cheng was saying, I mean, in China, when it talks about, say, and you mentioned also Belt Road, there is this propensity to say, this is great, this is for harmony, and that is true, that's stated. But at the same time, people are now looking at China not just necessarily from a Cold War standpoint, but they see other actions China takes, and they make assumptions or judgments. And that's not necessarily related to the Cold War. That's the modern China. It's the modern U.S. I'm just trying to bring the conversation a bit out of that. Now, I think from the Chinese perspective, though, there's a lot of feeling that, oh, you're bashing us again, just like we did. And indeed, America took a very unpragmatic, to use Bao Cheng's word, unpragmatic stance towards China during the Cold War. And it wasn't until Nixon and Mao and others got together and we realized, hey, we could in fact get along, and then you had reform and openness in '79. So, there is a bit of that, I think, in the China bashing. But I think in terms of the exact points of these agreements and what's going on, I think it's not quite correct to say it's Cold War. It's really about the new China and that superpower that it presents and the fear. There is fear. Now, you could say that fear is maybe unjustified, but there is fear.
Do you think there should be a paradigm change in terms of international relations? Because obviously the Thucydidean trap theory cannot explain the rising of a civilizational state like China.
Well, I'll state first, I'm sure Bao Cheng has ideas on that too. I think what you constantly hear, you can go back to Greece, you can go back to, more commonly, Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, pointed out the rise of Germany preceding World War I. I think those references are outdated. China, yes, it's armed, it has a powerful army, but you don't have the same dynamics. In fact, the way so many of these treaties deal with IPR wasn't something that was really part of the mix of global trade 100 years ago, yet it is now. In fact, the internet had no presence in our thinking even during the Cold War. So we're in a different dimension. It doesn't mean there aren't dangers, but I don't think those references to Greek warfare really apply here.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We'll continue this discussion very soon. And you're watching Dialogue on CCTV News. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Dialogue on CCTV News. We continue the discussion on US President Barack Obama's article, TPP, and he points the finger to China. So, gentlemen, he presents the TPP, Barack Obama presents the TPP as an advantageous agreement for America. So, what about other participating countries? Do you think they can get a fair share of the pie, Professor?
Yes, I think there is the general commitment to reduce substantially on the tariff side, which is going to liberalize more of the trading procedures, sanitary, phytosanitary, and so this is any sort of integration mechanism. Theoretically and hypothetically, where it would bring benefit to the participating members. And also given some of the domestic chaos in many of those underdeveloped countries, external force may push forward for better transparency, economic regulation, and also more marketization that is going to benefit their nation. But having said that, it doesn't mean that, well, there's going to be a very much balanced the benefit to all, because now, look at the simple fact, who is there dictating the terms, and who is sitting in the driver's seat. So, clearly in his article identified U.S. and the rest of the participating members. So U.S. interest is definitely placed in the top and priority position. So in this way, whether the other members will be able to enjoy, given their capacity to export and given their competitive structure with the other members in the neighborhood. So that's really going to be a question mark. And also when ASEAN is also moving forward to this economic community, whether the TPP is going to be a disruptive force. So that's also remains a big question. And it is good, for many of the ASEAN countries that, well, they can shop, for the best ends from both TPP and RCEP, but eventually, they have to make their own sovereign decision in consideration of their own domestic issues.
Well, interestingly, you mentioned the ASEAN bloc. So, do you think the fruition of the TPP will stir the long and comparatively stable geopolitical order in the region?
Yeah, there is overlap in the TPP versus their own integration program, but there is still,
and even China's cooperation framework with ASEAN.
That's right. There is still, differences, and also in terms of the agenda and schedule. So there is also vast differences that needs to be ironed out, and whether the U.S. is going to further participate in the Asian, the ASEAN type of economic community. So that's also another question. So now, China has never said, okay, no, we're not going to join the TPP. And so when China is going to turn out to be a black horse, so far it seems that China is shaping its own agenda in the integration process by the Belt and Road program and by the RCEP. But after the China irons out the sort of the investment agreement or treaty with the United States, so will there be a sort of a change in the paradigm and also in the direction? So that's there's a lot of questions that need to be asked.
Right, Mr. Cap, as Professor Liu earlier explained, the TPP kind of paints a very beautiful picture for the future of world trade.
Right.
So, but why it has met so much opposition in the United States?
I mean, you could say because we have a democracy there, and you're allowed to do that. I mean, you don't see, I think, as much protest in Vietnam, where you don't have a democratic right to protest.
But if it's good enough, why the Congress has set so much pressure on possible ratification of the TPP?
Well, we could go into politics and so forth, but to take your question at face value, I think indeed there is controversy to address that point head on. It's not something that everyone thinks is wonderful, right? Like, well, at the same time, I was just going to say like universal health care, but Obamacare, even his bigger proposal and initiative as president, his signature package, met with all sorts of resistance, and yet the rest of the developed world looks at us, I'm American so I can say us, with askance because we don't have universal health care to the degree other places do. When we brought it in, it created controversy. Now we're doing something that's supposed to be good for trade, but there are viewpoints that point out really what this TPP initiative could be about on the negative side is more for corporate interests, vested IT, pharma interest in particular. And if that's the case, then obviously that wouldn't be benefiting everybody. You could, though, further argue, even accepting that critique, that, well, those are the future industries of America. If you're not protecting industries like that, how are you going to grow your economy?
Some outside media reports have pointed out that lack of transparency is a consistent problem of U.S. trade policy making.
Yes.
Do you think so? Like there's a piece in the Guardian newspaper has heavily criticized the Obama administration for a lack of transparency concerning both TPP and the TTIP with Europe.
Well, the Guardian does skew left in our spectrum of political leanings. That doesn't mean those criticisms aren't valid. Indeed, trade deals are conducted in secrecy. This is one of the ironies of modern democracies. When you do a trade deal, it's negotiators behind closed doors working something out, and then they present it in the United States case to the Congress, or in the case of Europe, usually parliaments. So there is the secrecy dimension to it. Now, because it's secret, it's not possible to fully evaluate it until it really comes to be presented for legislators to debate. I think the points they make have merit, if indeed these agreements have been done in a way, I think particularly with TTIP, where they've raised issues, is that, well, these American companies could dictate laws to European nations, which, if true, would obviously be a breach of sovereignty. However, they're saying they have these documents. I haven't seen them yet. I can't really comment. But I think this is where it does get into a gray area. If there's too much corporate interest saying, well, this is for economic growth that is promoted, then that's not good.
What's your take, Professor, on the lack of transparency in international trade policy making?
Well, because this is really a negotiation in those deals, it is not really a whole set of UN rules or WTO rules that are, that is there proposed by a neutral party that participation or not is left to choice. But now they choose to make it more like even in the sense of a commercial deal. So therefore, secrecy is a element that is necessary in this regard. But in the meantime, there is also a sort of negative side to it that how the world is going to be impacted, because TPP, has 40% of the whole world GDP. The world actually has a right to know, what could be the positive impact that you can exert on the rest of the economies, and also that there are many more stakeholders involved. So how businesses are, yes, they are there to serve the business interest, but how big companies would react towards this? How do they really get prepared? And many other government agencies, NGOs, etc. So therefore, and because it's going to be, implemented, they are also inviting many more other members. They are even looking at, the members from Central Asia to participate. So how would you really handle a closed door versus a sort of open attitude, towards the non-participating member and also other the APEC members.
So, gentlemen, since we've mentioned Europe, let's talk about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, a trade deal negotiated between the United States and Europe. It has also met much opposition and criticism in Europe. Do you think it's kind of similar with the case of TPP, Mr. Kapp?
The critiques I've heard there are along the lines of what I mentioned about more direct infringements on sovereignty. You don't hear that as much with TPP. TPP tends to get critiqued because it's saying, well, yes, it protects IPR, but pharmaceutical companies, what we call big pharma in the United States, are not really well loved because the argument is they overprotect their intellectual property, they charge too high prices. Anyway, the idea is then with TPP, they're allowed to take that model over and just exploit it further, and you could go down the line with IT companies and so forth. That's the kind of core argument. In TTIP's case, it's more that, well, those same companies can now be telling European countries, once you agree to this, if you don't like it, and you decide to pass legislation against the dictates of the agreement, we can sue you. Which is a very American legalistic. I know Professor Leal is a doctor of laws, so he can comment more on that. But so it takes it to another level, and it's much more of a kind of developed countries' concern that you would be, just like the Brexit issue is about sovereignty. I mean, a developed country is even more concerned about sovereign issues. So that's how, in a nutshell, I think you can compare the two. But some of the core issues are the same.
Yeah, while the rationale is the same, there is also fundamental difference in the economic structure. Actually, the across-Atlantic competition is more in parallel. So they are all highly developed countries, and they are competitive on the same footing particularly in the manufacturing industry, and also in the internet and high-end service industry. But in the TPP, we see more complementarity and more synergy, so that there could be less conflict. And another difference that is the bargaining power. So across the Atlantic, you see more of a balanced bargaining power over the table. But here, it's a big giant, dealing with,
it's about the driver and passenger.
That's right. Dealing with so many smaller nations, so they can only tick yes or no, in the well-cooked recipe.
So, gentlemen, let's get back to where we started, Barack Obama's article on TPP. So, since he bluntly pointed the finger to China, so how do you think China will respond, Professor?
Well, I think, China played very good in the Tai Chi manner.
Right.
So kung fu magic.
That's right. I'm not really, I'm not really pointing fingers into you to show that I'm more in the gentry class.
Right.
And we take it as a joke, but we, on the other hand,
Does China take anything as a joke?
Well, actually, China can really, given its size, given its confidence, China can really take it as a joke.
Right.
But on the other hand, we manifested our philosophy. We still wanted to have more market democracy in the equal participation in the rulemaking process.
Right.
And we are not really saying that our feeling is getting hurt
it shouldn't
again.
be not about criticism.
Upset.
Thank you
That's
very
right.
much,
We're
gentlemen,
not
for our
completely
input.
upset.
And that's it for this lively discussion of dialogue on CCTV News. I'm Pan Dong in Beijing. Bye-bye.